These are these children. They were not members of a Center for Command and Control of Hamas. As Dr. Najjar buries her children, this is Dr. Najjar. As Dr. Najjar buries her children, her husband, Hamdi, is still lying in deep coma. And her 10-year son, Adam, critically wounded, is lying in the hospital. We hope he will be surviving. If Hamdi finally awakes, what will she tell him? And when Adam asks about his brothers and sisters, what story can she tell him? President, in another horrifying scene, young Warda Sheikh Khalil, a 6-year-old girl, tried to flee the flames. Tried to flee the flames. The flames engulfing her school, her shelter, after an Israeli airstrike. This shelter, meant to protect displaced civilians, became a crematory oven. Her mother and siblings were killed. Her father now clings to life. No one in Gaza is spared. Not doctors, not women, not children, and not the displaced. Not even hope itself. Mr. President, figures lost meaning. What is worth of saying 18,000 children dead? These are not only numbers. These are lives. These are dreams. These are voices, playtimes, lullabies. They were extinguished. They were the warmth of homes, the joy of classrooms. They were the pulse of neighborhood. The Israeli army killed them. They killed them deliberately in a mother's arms, in classrooms, in hospitals, in bread lines under staircases, and in tents. Their deaths were not collateral. They were the consequences of a system that sees Palestinian lives as not human, as disposable. There is no fading echo. It is a scream, and these horrors must end. The remaining survivors must be allowed to live. The world must see these children, the Palestinian children, the children of Gaza, as its own children. For Warda, for Ala, for the thousands, for the 18,000 who never got a chance to say goodbye, we must act. Mr. President, words of condemnation are no longer enough. We must act now. Since October the 7th, Israel, the occupying power, has killed more than 54,000 people. Yes, it's no more 53,000 people. Today, it's 54,000 people. Israel wounded more than 123,000 people. And since March 18 alone, more than 3,900 have been killed and over 11,000 wounded. How many more must die before action is taken by the Security Council? How many orphans must roam the ruins of Gaza? How much more blood must be spilled before this council acknowledges that enough is enough? My country, Algeria, bears its responsibility and is determined to push the Council to act. The time for indecision is over. Mr. President, the Palestinian people were promised a sovereign state with Al-Quds al-Sharif as its capital by the General Assembly, by this very Security Council, and by the international community. Yet, 3 decades after Oslo, the dream of a Palestinian state is vanishing under the boots of the Israeli occupation and the silence of the international community. The Israeli occupation persists, emboldened by impunity, by immunity. Settler violence surges. Settlement spreads. Palestinian land is swallowed inch by inch, and holy sites are desecrated while the world looks on. The global system means to uphold justice has become paralyzed. So we ask, what is expected of the Palestinians? Must they continue offering their children on the altar of global inaction? Does the international community still believe in a two-state solution? President, Palestinians, like all human beings, like all people, have the right to life, to dignity, to homeland. They are not an exception. We must resolve this conflict as its roots. Not just a lasting peace can exist. Not just and lasting peace can exist without the realization of the Palestinian people's right to an independent state. As President Abdelmajid Tebboune stated, and I quote, "We must act decisively to end the ongoing historical injustice inflicted upon the Palestinian people. We must urgently revive the peace process, which is currently facing an unprecedented deadlock. It is imperative to compel the occupying power to comply with the relevant United Nations resolutions and to adhere to its obligation. The solution is well known. It's time for its implementation. I thank you.
I thank the Permanent Representative of Algeria for his statement, and now I give the floor to the Permanent Representative of Denmark.
Thank you, Mr. President. And let me also thank Special Coordinator Kag and Dr. Sinwar for their important and thought-provoking briefings this morning. Mr. President, this Council has continuously discussed the immediate effect, devastating effect, of a number of concerning recent developments in the occupied Palestinian territories. In Gaza, we've discussed the disastrous humanitarian situation, more than 53,000 dead, over 100,000 injured, and the entire population on the brink of a man-made famine. As part of an overwhelming majority of voices in this Council, Denmark reiterates once again that humanitarian aid must flow freely and at scale into Gaza in line with international humanitarian law and the humanitarian principles. We have opposed an expanded Israeli military offensive, and we have called for an immediate end to the war, along with the immediate and unconditional release of hostages. In the West Bank, we've called for an end to settler violence and illegal settlements, which have recently accelerated an unprecedented speed. Yet, we continue to witness forced displacement, demolitions, and movement restrictions imposed on Palestinians. Mr. President, as we condemn the immediate effects of these developments, this Council has a responsibility to address their long-term impact on international peace and security. And let me make 3 points in this regard. First, the people of Gaza are starving. Starvation, especially for children, can cause irreversible harm that could impact the rest of their lives. The IPC warns that 71,000 children under 5 years old and 17,000 pregnant and breastfeeding women are threatened by acute malnutrition. We stress the need for Israel to take immediate action to protect the human rights to life. All parties to the conflicts are bound to comply with international humanitarian law and the obligation to protect civilians, including Palestinian children, from harm. We also recall that the right to food is a fundamental human right. Second, the war in Gaza has caused major destruction of civilian infrastructure with devastating effects on children's education. More than 95% of all schools in Gaza have sustained damage. 660,000 children are pushed out of school and have lost as much as 19 months of education. In occupied East Jerusalem, another 800 students were forced out of their classrooms earlier this month after Israeli forces forced the closure of 6 UNRWA schools. Losing access to education risks leading to long-term consequences for children's well-being and learning. Education is critical for coping with trauma of war, and we just heard this morning Dr. Sinwar assessing that half of Gaza's children are suicidal. And education is critical for building relevant skills needed to rebuild the country once the conflict is over. We reiterate that civilian infrastructure, including schools, must be protected, included by refraining from the use for military purposes. We call for Palestinian children's rights to safe education to be protected. Third, in the West Bank, Israel is taking control of record amount of Palestinian land, displacing Palestinians into isolated enclaves, making it virtually impossible to form a contiguous and viable future Palestinian state. We recall that the EU has adopted sanctions against violent extremist settlers and encouraged other council members to do the same. Recently, we have also taken note of the Israeli government's disturbing decision to initiate land registration in Area C and register it to private Israelis. Denmark reiterates that any attempt by Israel to annex Palestinian land would be unacceptable and violate international law. Mr. President, in Israel, Hamas' heinous terrorist attacks have caused extreme and lasting trauma and has pushed Israelis and Palestinians further apart. We continue to condemn the brutal terrorist attack and the ruthless hostage-taking by Hamas, and we reiterate our demand that all hostages must be immediately and unconditionally released. Taken together, these developments do nothing to serve the long-term interests of peace and security for Palestinians and Israelis. Denmark remains firmly committed to Israel's security. However, this cannot come at the cost of the civilian Palestinian people and their right to live in peace and dignity. I therefore reiterate Denmark's urgent calls to Israel to halt the ongoing and intensified military offensive and immediately allow for the full resumption of humanitarian aid. The United Nations and humanitarian organizations must be allowed to work independently and impartially to save innocent lives now. We can neither ignore the devastating immediate effects of the current developments nor their long-term impact on future generations of Palestinians and the viability of the two-state solution. Denmark maintains that the two-state solution is the only viable path to achieve permanent peace and stability in the Middle East. We look forward to the upcoming conference on the implementation of a two-state solution. I thank you.
I thank the Permanent Representative of Denmark for her statement, and now give the floor to the Permanent Representative of Slovenia.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. And I want to thank Special Coordinator Kak for her briefing today and for asks. I also want to thank Dr. Sinwar for his testimony and for his work in Gaza. Mr. President, many times we have said we are lost for words, but we cannot repeat these phrases over and over again. Early on during our council term, I instructed my team to avoid lengthy explanations of the situation on the ground in our statements. This is for the briefers, who usually on a weekly basis or even more often inform us about the state of affairs. And here at the UN and in the Security Council, I think we are very lucky. We are very privileged. We are honored to have the best briefers on the situation on the ground. From Special Coordinator Kak to Undersecretary General Fletcher to civil society briefers like Dr. Sinwar today. Our role is not to challenge the briefers. is not to challenge the messages, but to address the message. Our role is to take positions, to be the one who takes into account briefings, the one who can carefully examine the positions of the others and find possibilities for the Council to react to threats of international peace and security. Mr. President, my statement can be summarized in one word and one sentence. The word is responsibility. And the statement is, we have responsibility to protect civilians in Gaza. Burning tents, striking schools and shelters, continuously displaying civilians, causing hunger, shutting down hospitals, cutting essential services. These grave violations of international humanitarian law and human rights law have pushed thousands of civilians to the brink of survival. As the task of listing every single cruelty has become impossible, our responsibility not to remain silent has become clearer, and the responsibility to act. We have a clear responsibility to protect civilians. With the alarm bells ringing through the latest IPC report and the information circulating on the hunger in Gaza, we continue calling for immediate lifting of the blockade on Gaza. As the full blockade surpasses 2 months, we must be clear that the current volume of aid reaching Gaza is not enough, and that entry at scale and safe and unhidden distribution are urgently needed. Crossings need to be open. All possible corridors used and facilitation must be granted. Safe passage for medical personnel and humanitarian workers must be guaranteed. Time is of the essence. We repeat that any actor delivering humanitarian assistance must adhere to international humanitarian law and international principles on humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. We repeat our deep concerns over the new model of distribution of aid. We welcome the UN coordinated plan to resume humanitarian aid deliveries to Gaza, and as clearly underlined in today's statement by the EU High Representative Kallas, we recall the indispensable role of the UN in distributing humanitarian assistance. During the ceasefire, the UN proved that it can deliver if allowed. Mr. President, we have a clear responsibility to act. This is why Slovenia fully supports the ongoing efforts of Egypt, Qatar, and the United States to find a negotiated solution for a ceasefire in Gaza. We call on all parties to engage in good faith. This is why Slovenia strongly supports the conference on the two-state solution to be held in June under chairmanship of France and Saudi Arabia. But we do believe these efforts should be done hand in hand with the action of the Security Council. Time is of the essence. The Council should be clear in its unambiguous demand for unimpeded humanitarian access, and that is why we support urgent action of the Council. We hope the Council will show unity when voting on a humanitarian resolution that is now being discussed among the elected members. Mr. President, remaining silent is not an option. Thank you.
I thank the Permanent Representative of Slovenia for his statement, and now I give the floor to the Permanent Representative of France.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, France thanks the Special Coordinator, Madame Sigrid Kaag, as well as Dr. Feroz Sinwar, for their briefings, which serve as a reminder of the ordeal being endured by civilians in Gaza. Mr. President, France will never forget the heinous terrorist crimes perpetrated on 7 October 2023. The hostages who remain in Gaza in the hands of Hamas and other terrorist groups must be released. And the minister has recalled here, reiterated the fact that Hamas is not and cannot be a part of the solution in Gaza. Hamas needs to be disarmed and must be politically neutralized. However, the civilians in Gaza are not Hamas, and civilians in Gaza are enduring a humanitarian situation that is devastating. And the Security Council has an obligation to act in response by continuing to demand that Israel meet its obligations under international humanitarian law, and the Security Council must act and adopt a humanitarian resolution. Firstly, all obstacles to the entry and delivery of humanitarian assistance and all restrictions on the quantity and composition of this assistance need to be lifted. The highly limited quantities of recent days are insufficient when it comes to meeting the needs of the populations, especially after 12 long weeks of total blockade. The images of desperate, starving people throwing themselves on trucks and aid distribution points are a tragic illustration of this. Dozens of tons of assistance financed by France and other countries not being delivered to Gaza is unacceptable. Second, we reiterate our full support for the United Nations and humanitarian partners thereof, who have demonstrated their ability to deliver assistance fully in line with humanitarian principles. We applaud the plan that was announced on 16 May, which shores up safeguards against the risks of a diversion, and we call in this regard upon Israel to facilitate and to allow for full access of UN personnel to Gaza in order to verify the delivery of humanitarian assistance as stipulated in Resolution 2720. We recall our support for UNRWA, the Undersecretary General Fletcher, and to his services, and we support all UN agencies, funds, and programs, as well as systems who are working on the ground, seeking to provide honest, impartial testimony and to deliver on humanitarian needs. We call upon Israel to allow the United Nations and humanitarian partners to operate in full safety and security, the establishment of an alternative system which neither international law nor humanitarian principles thereof, and which engenders forced displacement of people is simply unacceptable. Yesterday was a stark illustration of the limitations of the mechanism that Israel has established. Moreover, France recalls its firm opposition to any permanent occupation plan by Israel for the Gaza Strip and the forced displacement of people. These grave violations of international law are leading to a complete impasse. Moreover, the protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure is part and parcel of Israel's obligations under the Geneva Conventions. Recurrent strikes targeting schools, hospitals, homes are unacceptable and must end. Mr. President, there is an urgent need for Israel to cease its military operations, for a permanent ceasefire to be established in Gaza. We call upon the parties to revert back to full respect with the ceasefire, and we applaud the efforts undertaken by the United States, Qatar, and Egypt as they endeavor to facilitate negotiations. I wish to reiterate the following. We stand in solidarity with all the families of all of the hostages who need to be released without delay. We reaffirm the right of Israelis to live in safety and security. We condemn the recent Houthi attacks. However, there's an urgent need to propose an alternative to war for Palestinians and Israelis, an alternative rooted in the two-state solution, one that reflects the legitimate aspirations of the two peoples, Palestinians and Israelis, to have a state and to live in peace and security. France thanks member states for their mobilization during the preparatory meeting on the 23rd of May, specifically those who have accepted responsibility of the working group. There's a need now to adopt concrete political, financial, material commitments to preserve the two-state solution with a view to the convening of the conference, which France will co-chair with Saudi Arabia on the 17th to the 20th of June 2025. This is an international conference which will be convened at the request of the General Assembly to support the two-state solution here in New York. The foreign minister recalled that France wishes to see this conference resulting in meaningful progress on peace, security for Israel and Palestine, the recognition of Palestine as a state, normalization and regional integration, disarmament of Hamas, and the restoration of Palestinian governance. Thank you.
I thank the Permanent Representative of France for his statement, and now I give the floor to the Permanent Representative of Guyana.
Mr. President, thank you for convening today's meeting. I also thank Special Coordinator CAG for her comprehensive briefing, and I have also listened carefully to the moving testimony of Dr. Sidwa. Mr. President, about 2 weeks ago, we received a sobering briefing from USG Tom Fletcher as he appealed to us to seriously examine the legacy of this council, or the legacy this council would leave in relation to what is currently taking place in Gaza. Today, we have again heard a similar appeal from Special Coordinator CAG and Dr. Sidwa, even as the situation continues to worsen in unimaginable ways. No one should be made to live under the horrific circumstances that Palestinians in Gaza have been experiencing since 7th of October. This council must take principled and urgent action in response to the grave situation that has been foisted on the Palestinian people in Gaza. Mr. President, as efforts continue for achieving a return to the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas, Guyana is of the view that any peace deal reached should have at least 3 guarantees. First, Palestinians should not be forced to give up any of their rights in exchange for peace. Specifically, they should not be forced to forfeit their homeland. A choice between continuation of the Israeli offensive and forced displacement is a false choice. Second, any peace deal should comply scrupulously with international law. The war in Gaza has set, or seen attempts to set, precedents that are plain violations of international law, particularly international humanitarian law. Recall, for example, restrictions imposed on the United Nations and humanitarian workers. The Knesset legislation against UNRWA is a case in point. Recall also Israel's ongoing aid blockade and its proposed mechanism for aid delivery under the control of its military. Third, the protection and well-being of civilians should remain the chief consideration of any peace deal. Mr. President, the situation in Gaza continues to worsen in unimaginable ways, as described by Special Coordinator. We are especially concerned by the escalating strikes on tents, residential buildings, schools, and crowded hospitals, and the methodical destruction of entire neighborhoods. The constant evacuation orders and the militarization of the majority of the Gaza Strip are equally concerning. There is nothing that can justify this level of violence against civilians, among whom are children, including babies. The aid blockade, which was imposed on 2nd March, seriously crippled the humanitarian efforts that were facilitated by the ceasefire deal. While noting the recent lifting of some restrictions by Israeli officials, we simultaneously noted that certain measures are severely limiting humanitarians' ability to take advantage of this small respite. We noted, for example, the challenges created by insecurity, delays in coordination approvals, and inappropriate routes being provided by Israeli forces that are not viable for the movement of cargo. These are all man-made obstacles. We call on Israel to fulfill its international legal obligations regarding access to essential goods and services by the civilian population of Gaza. The provision of aid must be governed by the humanitarian principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. Guyana expresses its confidence once again in the ability of the United Nations and its partners to deliver aid at the required scale throughout Gaza, if given the relevant facility by the occupying power. The UN has consistently demonstrated its readiness every time there has been an opportunity to get aid into Gaza. The state of food insecurity in Gaza is also extremely extremely worrying, with many Palestinians experiencing what they described as a slow death sentence. The testimony of humanitarians in Gaza that, and I quote, Palestinians prefer to die by an airstrike than to go through the suffering of a lack of food and lie to their children about their next meal, end of quote, is an indictment on those who have created these types of choices for innocent civilians. Mr. President, colleagues, it has not escaped us that while negotiations, which we welcome, are ongoing to reach a nuclear deal with the objective of avoiding the potential destruction of another country, different weapons are being employed against the Palestinian people, resulting in their destruction. Regrettably, we are not responding meaningfully to counter the actions of the Israeli Defense Force. What makes this even more concerning is the fact that the visuals of the decimation of Palestinians are live streamed across the globe, yet we are not acting to stop it. The judgment of future generations will be justifiably harsh towards us. We who saw the attempts at obliterating an entire people, but did not act. This Council has the opportunity to act now. Enough is enough. Mr. President, in light of the foregoing, Guyana is compelled to reiterate the following appeals. First, we call for an immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire in Gaza, in accordance with Resolution 2735. Nothing justifies the collective punishment of the Palestinian people, and it is clear that the military objectives set by Israel cannot be met without severe consequences for civilians. Second, Guyana reiterates its call for the release of all hostages being held in Gaza, as well as all Palestinians detained by Israel without charge. The taking of hostages is a war crime, and all perpetrators must be held accountable. Third, Guyana appeals to Israel to completely lift the humanitarian aid blockade on Gaza and to allow the United Nations and its partners to carry out their life-saving work. International humanitarian law demands that Israel fulfill its obligations towards civilians, and the International Court of Justice has reaffirmed this. Finally, Guyana appeals to this Council and the international community as a whole to work urgently to revitalize the two-state solution as the only just and comprehensive solution to the Palestinian question. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Somalia.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank the Presidency for convening this timely meeting in light of the deepening humanitarian crisis in the occupied Palestinian territories. We thank Ms. Sigrid Kaag for her briefings and for her efforts at the UN Special Coordinator for the Middle East peace process. We also thank Dr. Feroz Sedwa for his briefings. We remain gravely alarmed by the dire humanitarian situation in Gaza, where the continued military escalation has pushed the population to the edge of survival. There is quite simply no safe place to go in Gaza for civilians. The recent reports of famine risk, forced displacement, and destruction of vital infrastructures are deeply distressing. This is a crisis entirely man-made and preventable, which is exacerbated by the persistent denial of access to a life-saving aid. Somalia strongly condemns the ongoing restrictions on humanitarian access and calls for an immediate, safe, unhindered delivery for the assistance throughout Gaza. All border crossings, including Rafah and Karim Shalom, must be reopened, and international humanitarian law must be respected without exceptions. We also express our concern regarding the mounting pressure on UNRWA and reiterate our full support for its critical role in serving the Palestinian refugees.
Attempts to legitimize or defund the agency threatens not only the rights of the refugees, but also the broader stability of the region. We are further troubled by the continuous settlement activity and settlement violence against civilians in West Bank, and the erosion of the legal and historical status quo of the Jerusalem. The right of the Palestinian people, including their right to self-determination, return to their homeland and statehood, are not subject to negotiation or delay. Mr. President, the blatant disregard for binding decisions of International Court of Justice, including the provisional measures issued in January and March of this year, is a direct challenge to the international legal order. Israel, as occupying power, bears legal responsibility under the international humanitarian law, including the Fourth Geneva Convention. These obligations are not optional. They are binding, and they must be enforced. Attacks on civilians and obstruction of humanitarian aid, targeting a medical facility, and the use of starvation as a weapon of war all demand independent investigation and credible justice redress. The consequences of this prolonged conflict are not limited to Gaza. The crisis has triggered widespread regional instability, increasing tensions across the Middle East. The situation risks spiraling into a broader confrontational with a serious implication for the international peace and security. Mr. President, this Council cannot remain silent as innocent lives are lost and humanitarian norms are violated. We call for an immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire, the full restoration of humanitarian access across Gaza. Somalia supports all credible diplomatic efforts aimed at the escalation and the conflict resolution, including the upcoming International Peace Conference, co-hosted by Saudi Arabia and France. We urge the international community to seize this moment and relaunch a serious political process toward a just, lasting peace, one that guarantees the establishment of independent and sovereign Palestinian state with Al-Quds Sharif at its capital, in line with international law and relevant United Nations resolutions. To conclude, Mr. President, my delegation reaffirms its commitment to working alongside fellow Council members and regional partners to uphold international law, defend humanitarian principles, and advance the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Somalia for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. I thank Special Coordinator Karg and Dr. Sinwar for their briefings today, which painted a catastrophic picture. Let me pay tribute to you and to your humanitarian and health worker colleagues working tirelessly to alleviate this suffering. I'll make 3 points. First, the UK has always supported Israel's right to defend itself. It suffered a heinous attack by Hamas on 7 October, and hostages have been through an unimaginable ordeal. We reiterate our call for their immediate and unconditional release and accountability for those responsible. But as my Prime Minister has said, we strongly oppose the Israeli government's escalating military action in Gaza, which is wholly disproportionate. An immediate ceasefire, not more bloodshed, is the way to secure the release of the hostages and stop the endless cycle of violence. Second, as we have heard again today, the level of human suffering in Gaza is intolerable. Civilians face starvation, displacement, and trauma. The UN warned of the risks from the Israeli government's plan for aid delivery. In Rafah yesterday, we saw this warning become a reality. The Gaza Humanitarian Foundation lost control of its distribution centre, with multiple casualties reported and great distress for those desperately seeking aid. In contrast, the UN has a clear plan to deliver life-saving aid at scale. It contains robust mitigations against aid diversion. Brave humanitarians stand ready to do their jobs. 9,000 trucks wait at the border. Our message to Prime Minister Netanyahu is clear. Let aid in and enable the UN to operate now. We reiterate our support for the UN, OCHA, and all its aid agencies. We also reject the Israeli government's unacceptable intention to take control of the Gaza Strip. Permanent forced displacement is a breach of international humanitarian law. Third, President, in the West Bank, violent settlers continue to assault and abuse Palestinians, forcing entire communities to flee. In Jerusalem, provocative visits to holy sites and inflammatory language by Israeli ministers are adding to the tensions. On 20 May, the UK announced further sanctions on individuals and entities promoting violence against Palestinian communities in the West Bank. We will continue to act against those committing these abuses. President, the UK will not give up on the two-state solution. We will continue to work closely with France, Saudi Arabia, and all our partners towards a successful conference in June, which moves us towards this goal. Finally, let me finish by condemning the horrific murders of Yaron Lishinsky and Sarah Milgrim in Washington, D.C. last week, and offering condolences to their families and to their colleagues. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Panama.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Panama would like to thank you for convening this meeting, and we'd like to thank Madam Sigrid Kaag, Interim Special Coordinator for the Peace Process in the Middle East, and Dr. Sinwar Feroze. Thank them both for their briefings. And we recognize the representatives of Israel and the United Arab Emirates and the Observer State of Palestine, who honor us with their participation in this meeting. And we thank the briefers for the dramatic details they shared with us. Panama is very concerned about the testimony and images that bear witness every day to the fact that Gaza and the West Bank are going through a humanitarian catastrophe of devastating proportions. We reiterate our urgent call for a restoration of an immediate ceasefire that will facilitate safe access for vital humanitarian assistance and the immediate, dignified and unconditional release of all the hostages. President, the 7th of October 2023 was a turning point. On that day, which should have been like any other day, this became a